Hello, this is Jake. You are listening to The Vault, and today we are joined by Smokey the Bera. Welcome, Smokey.
Hey man, good to be here.
So first thing I was thinking about while I was waiting for you today was you have this whole mimetic nature about you and about your company. And so how do you think people address you different? Because I've seen it. And I see how people change their tones when they're talking to you versus when they're talking to somebody else in space.
I mean, I think it goes both ways, right? I think that it means in some cases people are like much less serious to a fault. In other cases, people like perhaps recognize like the native nature of it to some extent. So it ends up being a little bit of like a aha, like maybe I'm gonna make a joke out of this.
Yeah.
And other times it's a little bit more of like an if you know, you know kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like I don't think about it too much, but then I get a pretty good like initial sense.
Yeah. You got to notice it though, right?
Yeah, like at times you can be like, okay, like this person is like instinctively dismissive, like perhaps I don't like him.
Yeah.
And then other times like, okay, this person kind of just like rocks with a meme and sees what happens.
Yeah, you see people lean in, I think, more than not, right?
Right,
Or
definitely,
like,
definitely.
even with just GM,
Yeah,
like people associate that with you now.
yeah,
Which
just
is
like
wild.
I mean, I think that like people are just down for stuff that's a little bit less buttoned up than normal, which is not a bad thing. I think that's like half of crypto culturally, right?
Totally.
I think that's sort of where we try to err towards.
Have a little bit of fun.
Yeah, like keep it sane.
Yeah. So take me on the journey of Berachain. How'd you guys start and how'd you guys get to where you are today?
I mean, yeah, very weird question. Well, very real and very like weird story. And then I don't think we started with a grand vision in mind or anything of the sort. We started very much, um, you know, and I'd say that like the whole backstory was myself and my co-founder had been spending, we've been in that crypto since 2015, 2016. But that was just buying ETH and Bitcoin, living in the valley, and seeing a bunch of people going and starting interesting L1s or alts. But before it became the thing that everyone did in 2017/18, right? And I think that what we noticed more than anything else in time was like, okay, cool. It's like, big casino. Like some of this is cool from like an internet money or like decentralization point of view. But there wasn't a uniting factor. There wasn't something that made us think like, okay, cool. Like this is truly the future.
Yeah.
I think DeFi Summer was an interesting, like, pilling event in that it's like, okay, cool. Like you've got this application, you've got this operating system of Ethereum, and then you've actually got interesting applications on top of it. So that kind of like, made us buy in, I think, a bit more to the fact that this could be something more than just shitcoins in 2017/2018. And then sort of DeFi Summer like 2.0 or round two, whatever you want to call it, in like 2021, right? Which I'd say was combined with a lot of the, advent of like interesting new NFT projects that were more than, your 10K profile pictures of monkeys and whatnot. And I think that Berachain was sort of born in between, those two spaces, if you will. The Venn diagram overlap sliver. Um, the biggest thing was like we were spending a whole bunch of time in these DeFi communities and these DeFi discords, and we thought to ourselves, okay, cool. Like, there's people who are building interesting things here. They're pretty lackadaisical. At the same time, we've seen like these NFT collections come to life that are like parallel type things,
Sure.
right? That we're not just here's a bunch of like random profile pictures, but here's actually, this Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone like card game that actually has like a greater degree of interest to it, right? And we thought that was kind of cool, like conceptually. And we basically just said, hey, like, let's see if we can do something in the NFT space, like for fun and see what that turns into. So we made 100 NFTs of bears and it was like 0.069 ETH per bear. For again, because we thought it was funny.
Yeah.
This informs a lot of our strategy, actually. And then, people sort of took to them more than we would have expected. And there's a community of like, 80, 90 people that formed and some people had duplicates and whatnot. Um, and I think that because these guys are all like DeFi heads by nature, they were kind of thinking like, okay, what happens next? Like, what do we do with the bears? And we were also thinking, what do we do with the bears? So we decided to make them like rebase or multiply and supply over time and basically spawn new collections. And if you owned one of the first collections and you got one of the second collections for free, if you owned those two, you got two for free in the next one, so on and so forth. So it became an interesting like distribution mechanism because on one hand, your earliest holders are quite handsomely rewarded, assuming these things maintain value.
Yep.
On the other hand, you basically have increased distribution, decreased scarcity over time, which is like an odd combination of
Right.
events. And I think given the demographic of like far left curve and far right curve folks there, where you had like some folks who were just deep in the trenches and thinking about nothing but NFTs and what the newest whitelists were and whatnot. And on the other hand, a bunch of folks were just thinking, no, it's not about mud. Yeah, just straight up playing in the mud and eating mud and like, DeFi mechanisms and Ponzi games.
Yeah.
And I think it was like talking to that community for a while and also just sort of, I'd say, observing broader trends within the L1/alt L1 space that pushed us towards actually starting Berachain. Um, in that we were just like, it seems inherently nonsensical that there are these networks like, AVAX, Near, like Fuel, whatever there was at the time. Not even Fuel. There were Fuse. That's what it was. It was, Flash in the pan, but it was a flash.
Yep.
That basically had, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars securing their values that, in some cases staked investor tokens and whatnot, but other cases just like, existing capital, that was keeping the network alive and functional, but was contributing nothing to its on-chain activity and its actual liquidity living on the chain. So we'd see these chains with like, 2 billion in the val set and like 10 mil on the chain. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. Like,
Kind of the fault of the whole vote.
yeah. And not even like necessarily just the vote escrow model, but more just like the cost of security to some extent,
Yep.
right? Like, I do believe that there's a sense in which, it is very important for a chain to have, sustainable security over time. As you think about long-term robustness, as you think about onboarding real assets, et cetera, that have, enough value to be worth attacking. But at the same time, it's like if you were paying, $2 billion a year, $300 million a year to secure 30 mil of capital, what are you paying for? Right. So I think that was sort of like the thesis that we were arriving at by accident. And we also very much found that there are all these applications that are building on different chains and just sort of hopping from chain A to chain B to chain C in search of wherever the little bit of hype is or wherever the grants might be. And I think that was like a more grant heavy meta back in the day. And we thought that was really stupid because like grants are typically quite extractive in my opinion.
Yeah.
And more than anything else, he just ends up with a set of builders that are, infantilized to a sense. So we thought, is there any way that the chain itself can be that tool for driving value to the application layer, as opposed to, having to rely on these like short bursts of like giving men fish, as opposed to teaching them how to do so.
Yep.
So that was sort of the latter part of the concept of proof of liquidity. It's okay, can we align liquidity with security at the network level, and can we make that productive and use that to actually support the app layer and the users of the network who are typically its largest, contributors towards real growth.
So throughout this process, when was the genesis of Smokey?
Oh man, that was I think it was like late 21. And that was just like, Discord. Like it was like, all right, like what should my handle be? And at one point it was something else, it was like Drippy Bear, something like that. I don't know why. It's like I think like we just chose stupid names.
Is there a Drippy Bear now in the
I
company?
don't think so. No. I don't like and
They
it,
retired.
yeah, it's hang up the jersey. And it wasn't even like bear related. I don't know why I went with that. I just think it was like a handle that was readily available. And then yeah, now like, just had Smokey on Discord and Twitter for a long time and just sort of ran with it.
And that first batch of NFTs came out when? That was
That was
2020.
like August 2021.
Okay.
Either August or July 2021. I can't remember now, but like yeah,
Interesting.
coming on to 4 years now.
That's wild. So I mean, and the start of the chain was what, 22?
I'd say the start of like the real concept of the chain was like very late 21, early 22. We raised our first seed round in like the March 22 timeframe. Um, and then I'd say it became more and more serious, and we started like, I'd say having something that's development, worthy, or something that would, be a reasonable DevNet candidate in like late 22. Iterated a bunch from there, sort of went from rolling our own VM that was a derivative of Ethermint called Polaris, to basically rolling our own full framework called Beacon Kit, which is what we use now and what Berachain's built around. I'd say proof of liquidity also evolved a fair bit over that time, thinking about just general risk surface and what can be done to make the chain as like robust but as secure as possible. Because there's a lot of like DeFi built into it as well, right? Which is a gift and a curse. It's great in terms of fee accrual and overall like value capture and whatnot, but it's also just more surface area for attack in certain cases. So I think that was a careful balancing act. Early 2024, which is when we launched our first testnet, then launched our second testnet in mid 2024, and then went live in early 2025.
Before we jump into get the details of the chain and proof of liquidity in general, what did you learn through that, 4+ year process that you think if you would have known, you could have launched sooner?
Um, I think that, the trickiest thing is effectively estimating engineering timelines, I think. I think we've probably both seen this in different ways.
Absolutely.
Um,
All over the place all the time.
yeah, so like, assuming a healthy margin of error, but also making sure that the dictator of that initial information set, knows it end to end, right? And I think it's really tough. I think basically what I would have done if I could go back in time was make sure we really clearly understood what do we want the end product to look like, and then basically see how we could moneyball a team together that basically had experience in each of those core areas, as opposed to saying, okay, these couple guys can like, one-man army multiple different things, right? Because I think that, taking that Moneyball approach is what ended up working really well for us later. But it took us too long to get there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um,
What about how you grew as a leader during that period?
I don't think I grew it up. No, I'm kidding. I think that
The
like
chain grew. That was it.
Chain grew. I think it was more about figuring out what it looked like to select for like incredibly high accountability people. And also, like, I think especially on the engineering culture side, to make sure that we selected against people who just were kind of like showing up because, good job, good pay, good brand, whatever it might be. And rather folks who were truly passionate or cared about the project and what the product actually might look like and what its applications might be, right?
Yeah.
But I do expect them to understand it. And I do expect them to, see why there's a reason for that to be interesting practically, or to understand why their work might contribute to something beyond just, hey, like I've pushed this novel PR, right? So I think that like it being able to to unite the company around like a real mission, from both just like a sub goal and overarching goal point of view was probably one of the biggest things that we did not do a good job enough at first, and one of the things that I've tried to like drill in as much as possible to new hires across the entire board. Because it's like, I don't know, it doesn't matter where you fit in the stack, but if you don't know what you're contributing towards, or if you don't get excited about that, then it's kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Like you should probably work somewhere you care about what you're building.
Right. So how do you think that's changed culture? And then like uh, additionally, what would your single unified vision be now?
Um, I think that unified vision is like, it's generic, right? But it's like also like building the best chain possible right now. But what does that look like? It's success across a number of different metrics. I think of it a lot as like app layer success more than anything else. In that I don't think that most people, care that much about the chain itself. And I think that's correct. Like I don't think that the main character should be Berachain. And I don't think that that should be the focus of everything. I just think it should actually be like, okay, these applications on Berachain are getting breakout adoption. Berachain's under the hood helping power these guys, helping direct proof of liquidity emissions towards them, making it easier for them to go from 0 to 1. But the chain itself, like, should be an afterthought in my
But
opinion.
we've learned that in
Yeah,
DeFi over time. Like that
100%.
that is what people care about. It's like
Yeah,
how are you actually interfacing with the thing?
yeah.
Doing that through dApps.
Exactly. Like no one cares that much about like, oh my god, I'm on Solana. Like, and maybe Solana is one of the only examples where people have cared a little bit about that because like the distribution side has actually come in and the UX is a little bit better. But in 9 out of 10 cases, it's not about the chain. It's like what is a unique, differentiated experience I'm getting here? What is a cultural experience I'm getting here? Whatever it might be, right? So, I think for me, it was just making sure that we were a lot more stringent in our in our hiring slash onboarding processes.
Yeah.
Um, you could have someone who's the most technically sound, but if they are not culturally correct, then they shouldn't be there, right? And I think that that was one of the places where we had made trade-offs in the past. We're like, okay, yeah, like this guy doesn't really get it, but like, he's pretty good at this, so we should just like make this happen and bring it
Yeah.
on, right? And I think that it's easy to have that problem compound,
Yes.
and to just fall into a pattern of being like, okay, but we really need to put out this fire, therefore we got to like slot this person in, even though we know we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole,
Right.
right? And then you're like, well,
And
fuck,
then the fire's out.
now what do I do, right? And then if you let that become a little more contagious, then you end up with these entire swaths or subgroups in the company that are lightly alienated, not because of like lack of effort per se, but just because like, they are not fitting the same mold as the rest of the group, right? Culturally or attitude wise, etc. So I think that that was it was a bit of astroturfing over time that we had to do.
And you think that fun, serious energy that you embody,
Yeah.
do you think that trickles down through the whole org? And you think your culture largely follows that?
I think that there's a good amount of overlap with it. I don't think that every person subscribes to that same energy, but I think that people are on average like, yeah, like they're the type of folks that can be pretty fun, but also are like deeply serious when they need to be.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's like a pretty good work environment in most cases, where you're like, okay, I don't feel like I'm gonna like die at any point in time because someone's breathing down my neck. But I
It's
also,
funny, right? Because it's kind of like it is how everyone is anyway. Even the serious people let loose at certain times in their
yeah,
life. They
totally,
go home, they're silly with their wives or
yeah, yeah,
their kids. Like they have that in them.
yeah, totally.
And then why make the workplace so negative and strict and
I mean, I would,
dodgy?
it also I think makes work a lot more like decent and tolerable
Yeah.
and like enjoyable, right? If you don't have to have like a triple mask on at every point in time.
I think everybody imagines that working on your team would be fun.
But I think it's dating. Like I think that sometimes it's not all sunshine and daisies and stuff, and that I think that we do run a relatively tight ship. I think that we do hold the team to like high standards, and I think that's a good thing for people who like want to like outperform and who people like have that chip on their shoulders per se. But I also think that if there was people who are just trying to like check out or like just trying to like collect a paycheck, they're gonna have a horrible time. Because when you drive accountability, like sometimes that leaves scars.
Right. So take me through proof of liquidity now.
Yeah. Look, so high level of proof of liquidity is that Berachain effectively it's a proof of stake network in a sense, in that there are there's a validator set that's staking Bear tokens in order to generate block rewards. However, the biggest difference in terms of Berachain, proof liquidity as a variant of proof of stake is that those block rewards and those emissions slash inflationary incentives as the chain produces more blocks are actually pointed inwards into the ecosystem as opposed to outwards towards a validator set and or its stakers slash delegates. Right. So the best way to think about it is that when Berachain produces a block, that block is actually being directed by the validators into applications in the ecosystem and their users, as opposed to typically, by validators to validators slash their stakers. And that becomes pretty interesting because it means that the chain's, security source is actually effectively supporting the chain's liquidity sources, i.e., its applications and the users of those applications. So that's the very highest level, which is to say, Bearchain sort of turns inflation on its head and actually pushes it internally as opposed to externally. The way that this works with a greater, degree of nuance is that every time a block is produced on Bearchain, each validator effectively has a cutting board or a pie chart, right? And it means that when they produce that block, the block reward is going towards, the different sections of that pie chart. So it could be, hey, I've produced 5 BGT or the Bear governance token, the emissions token of the network in this block. And, 2.5 is going to pool A on the DEX. And, 2.5 is going to, the supply side of this lending market. And this gets pretty interesting over time because um, on one hand, you can actually have a very tight relationship between validators and applications as validators choose to support or direct emissions towards different applications on the chain. On the other hand, it actually opens up opportunities for, I'd say unrealized capital efficiencies in the past because you can actually have an incentive marketplace of sorts between the chain's native emissions and applications looking to bootstrap their own liquidity. Because typically an application will, try to find ways to have its own liquidity in a DEX or a lending market, whatever it might be. And maybe they'll do like a liquidity mining program or a bonding program or whatever that might be and say, hey, I'm going to pair X against Bera and I'm going to emit more X for people who are, staking that LP token. And that's, great to a point, but it's also deeply inflationary. You're not able to really price your liquidity very effectively. You're just kind of saying, hey, we're going to throw this many incentives on it and whoever comes, comes. Right. The interesting thing with the, I'd say the proof liquidity model as it pertains to applications is that they can actually say, hey, I'm willing to, give the validator set or effectively give BGT, delegates slash boosters, 5 of my token in exchange for 10 BGT or whatever it might be. Right. And establish a little bit of an exchange rate. So it ends up being a pretty net positive equation for all parties involved because the chain's inflation slash block rewards that are natively produced are being directed towards the apps. The apps are able to use that for liquidity acquisition at a price that they are, comfortable with.
For that exchange rate model.
Mhm.
This is interesting. I didn't actually think about this
Yeah.
previously, where now there's a market for this. So this would have to be somewhat liquid or variable.
Yeah,
That
totally.
variable rate of BGT to
Like
what
token.
yeah,
Yeah.
X token
Yeah.
will have to be pretty fluid.
Yeah, and, like, I think that's something that will ideally become something that becomes more and more efficient over time, right? As in to start, it'll probably be very, beneficial for applications, right? From a cost efficiency point of view in that, you can think of the model or you can back into it by saying, right now there's about 1,000,000 BGT emitted per week. Bera is about $6, right? 1 BGT can be converted into 1 Bera. That's part of the whole proof of liquidity system, and burned one way at any point in time. So there's effectively $6 million of emissions, going out into the ecosystem at any point in time. A small portion of that, like close to 10%, is going to the validator set. So let's say, $5.5 million are going into the ecosystem and going into applications at any given week, right? And right now there's about, between 750 and $1 million worth of incentives from different protocols that are going to be pushed to BGT boosters slash delegates as proof of liquidity turns on actually in the next week or so. So it gets pretty interesting there is that you can actually say that an application is getting, a 5x or more return in most cases, assuming a relatively efficient marketplace
Yeah.
on their spend, right? So you could say, hey, this application has spent $1 of their token to get $5 of emissions, and that $5 of emissions to a liquidity pool or supply side in the money market, et cetera, can very easily turn into $50 of liquidity or $500 of liquidity in the money market, et cetera, right? Depending on, I'd say, the degree of adoption, what that asset might be, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where you get a really interesting money multiplier. It's like, hey, I turned $1 into $50, or I turned $1 into $500 for my protocol, and then I might be generating X number of fees on that. And then you can actually say, cool, now as an application, I've reached a degree of critical mass or a degree of escape velocity where I'm generating this amount of fees. I can actually use these fees as my incentives and basically use that to continue building up more BGT emissions towards me over time. Right. So that's like the almost ideal flywheel where an application uses proof of liquidity to get to a point of, escape velocity or, like degrees of product market fit, whatever that looks like within crypto. And then actually has a little bit of a sustainable revenue mechanism that can in turn feed into that incentive system.
Right. Super interesting.
Yeah.
So with the whole selection of applications in which they're receiving these in-kind tokens from, I mean, how does that work? So you're almost building a strategy as a validator, right?
Yeah, yeah, like, and I think the validators can very much, choose different ways to operate, right? And that think that we'll see a few different classes of validators. Some that will probably only be looking for incentives in the form of like very blue chip, sort of like, low risk tokens that actually probably a little bit look more like ETFs or index funds, where they say, okay, I'm gonna, take shots at, you know, incentives in the form of ETH or Bera or Bitcoin or Honey or whatever it might be, right? Just stuff where it seems that there's a relatively, known and or established value within a given vol parameter. I think others might take like venture bets and say, okay, there's all these new protocols that are between, 25 and 50 mil market cap slash FTVs. I'm going to try to work with all these guys in hopes that one of them goes to, like a billion, and then I've got my lottery ticket, right? And the thing to keep in mind is that validators and the applications and the users all play a role in this, in that users are choosing to delegate their BGT towards different validators
Right.
in the system. And that basically influences the weight that a validator has in voting and creating block rewards, etc. So the users that also pick these higher risk validators, right, tend to also have those outsized risk, parameters, but also outsized return profiles. Um, because at the end of the day, the validators are directing, emissions towards the applications, and the users are receiving it from those applications. So, you know, uh, coming back on that full tangent, I think it's really that like you'll have degrees of risk that people are comfortable with.
Yeah.
And some will just say like, yep, blue chips only. Some will say lottery tickets, and some might say, hey, I only want payments in stables, right? And I only want people to give me, honey or USDC. And that way it's like, super low risk, but probably like some degree of a stable yield. And then you have a pretty interesting yield product there.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting
Yeah.
because these validators are gonna be able to build. Here's risk from
Yeah.
1 to 10,
Yeah.
or just like name them. Even it's not even risk. It's like choose
Usually
you like.
strategy.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and like I think that's interesting because like typically validators are not sophisticated financial actors in the system, right? Which can be a gift and a curse, right? And on one hand, it's kind of cool because now we actually see applications trying to run their own validators, and basically building up their own DevOps slash SRE teams internally. On the other hand, you see some of these validators that actually have like liquid arms or venture arms or sort of like more commercially minded teams behind them, figuring out how they can really lean into this. Because I think that proof of liquidity, sort of by its nature and by the fact that there's these changing incentives over time, is something that rewards activity, right? And that the whole goal is to spur economic activity on Berachain. But I also think that that requires a set of folks who are not checked out per se.
Yeah.
And I think that is very typical within a validator ecosystem relation. In that, like, they will be, pushing new upgrades and pushing new patches as new software is released. But I don't think the validators are always in the business of like, being deeply tuned into the ecosystem unless they're, deep in the MEV trenches or something of the sort, right?
Totally. Yeah. So like this ultimately here, what we have is a system where users stake their Fera on receive honey, and the validators, or excuse me, BGT, receive BGT, and the BGT that the validators are inflating, or the inflation reward BGT, is delegated to specific applications, and they get to select which applications they want to push that BGT to
Yep.
help support the rest of the network, which in your case is applications.
Yeah, and the other way, and I'd say the primary way in which users get BGT is actually by sort of LPing or basically participating in those applications that are receiving emissions from those validator sets, right? That way, those users that are actually putting their BGT to work by voting for different validators are able to affect their own interests as well, right? So they could be, a massive farmer on Kodiak, like one of the DEXs in the network, and they could say, okay, cool, I've earned a whole bunch of BGT from these pools. I'm going to redelegate that to this validator that is pointing emissions towards the Kodiak pool, because then I'm going to effectively, help auto compound my own rates, right? So I think there's ways that, because the different degrees of freedom that exist, people can choose to play their risk parameters very differently. They could just aggressively farm stables, for example, and then say, okay, cool, but I'm going to, delegate my BGT to a validator that's taking a whole bunch of venture bets. And that's sort of how I hedge myself by saying, okay, cool, like I've got a very like, low risk source of BGT, yield per se, but I'll use that to get a whole bunch of shots at lottery tickets from the validators' incentives and commissions.
Right. So now we talked about BGT, we talked about Bera, and you mentioned honey. Before we move forward, it'd be great if you could just take us through what each of those are.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, Bera is a staking token in the network. That's a gas token. That's a liquid token. That's what's listed in different places, etc. And Bera is sort of like the base plate of a lot of the logic here, right? In that, in order to really have economic security for like billions of dollars of capital, about 3 billion on Berachain right now, you also do need some non-trivial amount securing that network, right? So that is a role that Bera plays. However, by staking Bera, one only can earn a tiny amount of the actual block rewards or inflation on the network, which is sort of required to pay that cost of security. So, while typical proof of stake networks will have somewhere between, let's say 8 and 20, like a pretty meaningful range of high single to low double digit emissions when it comes to block rewards for staking that native token. In the case of Bera, it's sort of like in that sub 2%, 3% range.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of those emissions are actually going towards BGT. And BGT, is the Bera governance token, and that is earned in two ways. One, via staking Bera, as mentioned, where you can earn a small amount, or two, via participating in proof of liquidity and effectively, LPing in different pools on the network that have been selected by the validator set effectively under on-chain governance
Let's
as
say, and eventually governance
is
itself, right?
exactly as effectively the recipients or the destinations for both BGT emissions and generation, right? Because the validators ultimately control where the BGT flows, but users ultimately control which validators have real say in that equation. Um, so yeah, and then the last one is Honey. Honey is fairly vanilla. It's sort of a stable coin that's meant to help sort of I'd say aggregate centralized stables and safe sources of capital within the ecosystem. More than anything, they're to defragment liquidity and become a little bit of a meta staple over time.
Yeah.
Also, something that's quite interesting just from like a branding point of view as well, in terms of a lot of different payment products and groups that are looking at building around Berachain. I do think there are interesting degrees of freedom that are unlocked by having your own stable, including upgrades to monetary policy over time. But that's all a decentralized governance process, not something where the foundation of the team is opinionated in any way.
Speaking of monetary policy, I remember when honey was money.
Yeah, honey, there was a point in which honey was money, and we no longer say those words so that my counsel doesn't kill me.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think honey's one of the really interesting pieces of this, where
Yeah.
it's an abstraction play.
I think it's cool, and I think that like it also plays roles in different parts of the system. For example, like right now, right in the early phases of POL, all of those emissions are pointed towards the DEX. But 50% of the fees from the DEX are actually right now 100% of the fees that the protocol, as in Berachain, would typically earn from the DEX are actually just redistributed to BGT delegates in the form of honey. So people who are LPing and then earning BGT and then basically staking slash boosting delegating that BGT are actually earning like at last I checked like 70% APY in the form of just stables.
Wow.
Which are like not a bad place to be in because you're taking those DEX fees and you're turning them into real yield for people.
Yeah, and ultimately something stable.
Yeah, 100%, right? And then over time, I expect that portion of that yield to decrease as more incentives flow to places outside of the DEX, and as they flow to these third-party applications and more exotic pools that are getting incentives from more exotic tokens.
What's your view and vision on LSTs?
I mean, I think the LSDs are going to be pretty like rampant on Berachain. I think they're healthy, especially as a proof of stake chain, right? Um, I think that the biggest thing to keep in mind is just like LSD centralization and the fact that that has a entire like chance of existing within the network. Um, I think that the bigger thing that we also have to be very careful about from like just a governance slash like practicality point of view is making sure that too many proof of liquidity emissions don't end up in just like LST pairs. Because then it's like, okay, cool. If I'm incentivizing an LST Bera pair with more BGT, like it's just sort of a self farm, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't accomplish too much from just an economic activity slash viability point of view. But at the same time, Berachain has a limited validator set as we use Comet BFT. So that set will cap out at 100 and change, right? Right now it's sitting at 69 max. And I think that, when it comes to actually supporting a meaningful amount of state capital, you do want to have as many simple ways for people to do that as possible. Because it's, unlike a DPoS chain where you can just have a bunch of people plow into one validator, you can't really do that logistically on Berachain. It's sort of the same logic as EVM or as Ethereum from a staking point of view.
Yeah. So you guys did something interesting too, which is you launched with applications built by Berachain to try and help jumpstart app adoption, right? So how is your vision change moving forward around supporting other ecosystem players that are now building and bolstering up
Yeah.
Berachain?
I mean, I think the fact is like we never wanted the native apps or the native app, Dex, Honey, etc. to be the be all end all. Actually, is more just there for two reasons. One is to actually get that proof of liquidity flywheel off the ground, such that there was a safe and kosher destination where validators could be effectively pointing emissions without having to worry like, okay, is this app going to rug? Is this going to be a security issue, etc. Two is setting a little bit of a high bar as well, because I think a lot of ecosystems at launch are plagued by like, 30 different uni forks and 20 different obvi forks.
Right.
And a lot of them end up just being kind of like fly by night scams. And that doesn't age particularly well. And that's also like one thing where, especially in this age or economy where attention's incredibly sparse, it's important to have like something that is reliable or at least perceived as safe. And also reduces the incentive for all like the random grifters to pop up, right? Because like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to outcompete this.
Yeah.
I think at the same time, it's good because it incentivizes the teams that actually have like the appetite to outcompete something that is like enshrined to some extent. Because then it's like, okay, if they think that they can beat this, that's great. Like, I'd rather encourage those teams to take those audacious shots. And that's sort of what the backstand or the enshrined apps are meant to do. But to answer your question wholly, I want to see the application ecosystem that's not built by Berachain flourish more than anything else.
Right.
Like it's if the Bex was like the main place that people cared about, then that's probably a failure in my mind. I think that it needs to be all the random different third-party apps that ideally outperform and make that base plate obsolete over time.
And I think that, I mean, it's already happening.
No,
Right.
100%.
Like Dolomite, right?
Don't let integrate stuff on the lending side, right? Euler's deployed recently, like, the Kodiak guys have been doing their thing, Infrared is doing their thing with all its T's. Like, there's a lot of these native apps that were not built by us anyway. And of course, we're close to these teams and are, very friendly. And I think that in many cases, they're very aligned with the end game and the goals of the ecosystem. But like, they get to do whatever they want. Like, we just help and every now and then play mall cop.
Yeah. So the chain activity has been great, which
Yeah.
I mean is a metric you can look at it a bunch of different ways and see how that compares. But the depth and like the liquidity, like Dolomite specifically,
Yeah.
has been very great.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when you're looking at something like that, where you guys really launched as being a DeFi native, like degen native, really,
Yeah, yeah.
really chain, and now you've got this opportunity where you have a book that can handle or can cushion the weight of institutions.
Yep.
So how has that changed how you view Berachain?
I mean, I think the bear chain's always been a bit of a barbell, right? And I think we'd rather lean into that than lean away from it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think there's a lot of more institutional, like trad adjacent stuff that's cooking under the hood. And that's meant to come at the right time because I also think that like you don't want to be trying to boil the ocean in terms of narratives or approach. But I do think there's like a natural evolution where one can say, okay, this ecosystem is bootstrapped by natives and folks who understand the space quite well from just like I don't even know what the right word is, but like a deeply mentally ill perspective.
Yeah.
But that also sets a good foundation actually for institutions to come in because I don't know. I don't think institutions or trad capital wants to go somewhere where they think they're going to get dumped on by each other.
Right.
They want to go somewhere where they think they have edge and an advantage, and maybe they do, and maybe they don't, because some of these folks who are natives there are quite sophisticated as well,
Yeah.
right? Um, so I think that it's more about setting the stage for that evolution, where it's almost like deep focus on the natives and applications that I think that your degens or tuned into crypto Twitter will be thinking about. In the interim, there's a little bit of a retail phase, but I don't even think retail is quite there. I think it's actually more like, the more, savvier crypto native, crypto leaning institutions. Then it comes like proper institutions and then comes, retail somewhere in that layer part of that mix.
I've had like a big think about this. Just at what point does a large bag holder really become an institution anyways?
Yeah, yeah, like there's
They function as one on chain. They have the
100%.
size for it.
Yeah, it's a matter of like what is your access to capital, what are your risk parameters,
Yeah.
what is your I think the biggest difference I probably think is like, the long termness or lack thereof of one's views. And then I think that the toughest thing to find from like the native audience is someone who's like, yep, I'm taking like a 3, 5, 10 year bet here, right? And from the institutional side, I think it's much tougher to get over that initial line.
Yeah.
But I do think that once they're there, it's much easier to say, okay, cool, like I've taken a bet here, I'm going to park capital and do all the work from a regulatory compliance, whatever it is, point of view to make this sit there for 10 years.
How how do you feel now?
And then like I think that we have on one hand we're seeing ourselves go live in like a pretty rocky market, which I think is again a gift and a curse. I think it's good for shaking people out who suck. And I think it's annoying because people are like, oh, why is the number up all the time? But oh, bro, you tell me, right? Like you can buy the token if you want. You can. But like I think that that's one of those things where I think we've just sort of like learned how to adjust to the pace of like being lined. And I think now we're trying to figure out the right structure and the right real North Star metrics to be chasing, and then how to take a very data driven approach to that.
Yeah.
Because I think that prior to launch, it's very easy to gaslight oneself and be like, okay, well, like, there's all this like hype about this, and like people are liking the posts a lot. Therefore, this must be good. But I think there's a different set of metrics that
Right.
matter post launch. And of course, like stuff like mindshare and overall, like I think influence and whatnot is certainly helpful there. but I think there's many more fundamental metrics that set the real scoreboard that we are spending a lot more time thinking about, right? And part of that involves, the sustainability of different applications on the chain and how many of these guys are generating real revenue and seeing a degree of breakout velocity. There's an understanding of how many of them actually have meaningful distribution funnels that are differentiated. There's an understanding of how much revenue and effectively how much, in terms of exogenous incentives will be flowing into BGT, because that's a very good measure for the health of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
There's sort of like the whole TVL to volume ratios of like, okay, how actively is our, actual liquidity being used? And I think that all these things end up being better, like second order metrics for determining whether a chain is trending up or trending down. And yeah, but I'm sure people are there, right? And someone just running like a bunch of MEV bots and spamming the show the network. Like, I think it's very easy for stats to get bastardized easily. So we'd rather lean. I think the biggest thing that like we've been thinking about since mainnet is like, let's lean away from the things that seem to give us comfort or make us think like, oh, we're doing more transactions in ETH, great, right? Like, I don't care about that.
Yeah.
Like, it's nice to have. It's nice, like superlative, like, right? But is that the end game?
It's fun to talk about and say you don't care about it.
Yeah, right. Like it's one of those things.
Well, it's a good stat.
Yeah, like check the box, but
Yeah.
what is functionally being accomplished here, right? And if we keep on chasing that goal of like sustainable economic activity, what are the actual components that drive towards that? So I think that that's one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time trying to better quantify internally, and then build just good data reporting rails for actually being able to hold ourselves accountable to that.
How do you personally feel from going from bong to chain?
I mean, it's kind of cool. I think that I'll get to see that like properly with like, like no holds barred, like, fully rolled out PRL. I'm quite excited for that. And then I have a lot of thoughts about, interesting things that could be done from an economic policy point of view to make things even more sustainable over time.
Is that like around capital efficiency or what?
Yeah, capital efficiency, like, should we have incentive responsive inflation, right? Like, as in, should it be something where if, there's a 2 million of incentives coming in, should there be some bounded range within which inflation should be, as there adjusted, or should there be some base rate plus some variable range, right? I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done there from a design point of view that just increase the efficiency of the system, because you also don't want to overpay for liquidity, but you also want to make sure you have a good balance of liquidity and security, right? So I think there's like 4 or 5 different levers to balance effectively. But I think that can be done in a very elegant manner. I think the way it is right now isn't broken at all. I just think that it could even be smarter.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm the farthest thing from an economist. I consider myself logical at best.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that I'd love to toy around with. And I've got our quant team just playing around with some ideas.
It's fascinating because you have so many levers to work with here.
100%. Like, there's a lot of degrees of freedom. And that's also, again,
Yeah, the modeling's crazy, right? Maybe you're pulling a lever, you're pressing a button, and you twist it out, and you're like,
so I think that it's a matter of like, and also that from a messaging point of view, right? Because too many knobs and levers is like, great to some extent. But it's also very bad in terms of just like, okay, how do you understand this?
right, clarity.
Right?
So
Just,
that's actually a question I had for you. Like,
yeah,
just talking through proof of liquidity.
yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, where I've heard you explain this to other people.
Yeah.
That think they get it, but then they try and explain it.
And they're like, what
They
the
don't,
fuck?
yeah, they don't get it.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
totally.
So how has that been from a difficulty perspective with like just even BD?
I mean, it's one of those things where even like recently we've just been having more and more like teach-ins with our team effectively, and just having like the guys on the team, like including myself, Jack, others who spend a lot of time on proof of liquidity education and talking to teams, just sort of walking them through like different, very almost like different manifestations of how proof of liquidity can be used, and what that gray space looks like.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that a lot of it has also been, more recently, just myself working with like legal counsel and the rest of our team to say, hey, what are we comfortable saying? Like, because there's some ways that we could describe proof of liquidity that might be very easy for people to understand,
Right.
but might not be
But
the,
very bad from a legal standpoint.
yeah, like you just want to make sure that we keep things kosher, right? And it's a matter of, I think, understanding what the right phrasing is intellectually correct and like accurate, but also doesn't either sandbag us or overexert us, right? So I think that's sort of like a little bit still of a work in progress. I think that helping people understand that a lot of the idea of proof of liquidity is redirecting inflation or redirecting block rewards into the ecosystem as opposed to out of the ecosystem has been like a pretty decent clicking point for the
Pure incentivization, right?
yeah, it's just it's flipping the model on its head, which I think aligns with a lot of our like broad theses on things. Because a lot of people are like, oh, like proof of liquidity is just like more inflation. I was like, no, it's the same inflation. It's just going in instead of out,
Yeah.
right?
They're like some parallels to even eigenlayer.
Yeah, 100%.
We have ADSs, and you're delegating that stake to
Yep.
a basket of ADSs, and
And then those ABS operators are figuring out what they do with it, right?
right.
So like there's a non-trivial education burden in all cases. And then I think the biggest thing is like making sure there's something to do with capital. And I think that's why, having a pretty robust application ecosystem and having an interesting incentive marketplace becomes really important there.
It's gonna be so cool to see like people who are running some of the best dApps on Berachain maybe are returning BTC to the validators.
Yeah, I mean, like, and then there's like
Like,
groups who are doing like BTC derivatives who are thinking about exactly that, right? Like, there's groups who are doing like sort of like CDFI type plays with Bitcoin arbs. They're thinking, okay, how do I scale this? Because one of the more interesting things that I hadn't even thought about for quite a while was that like proof of liquidity is a very interesting tool for scaling like sustainable RWA, financing methods. Yeah, it's right. And that if you have something that's throwing off 20% yield with a reasonable risk parameter, it's not like, it's not goldfinch per se, but it's something that's a little bit cleaner,
yeah,
and perhaps has a more predictable, recurring, like regular yield basis. Then it's pretty interesting to think about what that looks like. In that, let's say that something is throwing off 20% in yield, but then they choose to use 5% of that yield to re-incentivize that, that deposit contract, that pool, whatever it might be. And then assume that you have meaningful demand on the off-chain slash real world side of things.
yeah.
Then you can use that to scale things up quite aggressively. So we're seeing a couple like very interesting plays in that space that we think will be sustainable and quite healthy on Berachain, and sort of balance out that other side of the barbell where it's like, cool, you've got like the triple degen Ponzi,
Yep.
but you've also got like people doing like solar grid financing on chain. And I think that kind of stuff is well key.
It's such a hot topic right now, like, especially here
Mm,
at DAS.
Of
Like
course.
everybody's talking about it, and largely like you hear RWA, and you're like, oh, well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Are you doing what YAD at Galaxy did, and are you tokenizing a ION,
Yeah.
or are you working on building financial products, structured products, and
For sure.
and
Right. And I think there's going to be like cooler stuff in there in the future as the market trends towards things that have, I think just better like classic revenue fundamentals.
yeah,
Which is of course a tough concept to even consider as an L1 where you're used to being like cash flow negative by nature, right?
yeah,
So I think that there's something that's pretty cool there. I also think the Berachain is interesting because it's really the first ecosystem where you have a token in the form of BGT that's actually accruing exogenous value from the network itself and the different applications building on the
right,
network, right? So that doesn't mean that BGT has, is able to accrue value from a source that is not just itself,
right.
which I think is quite interesting in contrast to most network staking tokens slash L1 tokens over time.
I misspoke there too. YAD is Animoca, not
Yeah, it's good. Like,
Galaxy, but
yeah, but
correct.
but like structurally, right? Like, I think that people are on one hand, RWAs can be like, okay, cool, like we've got another variant of a T-bill, like now what, right?
Yeah,
On the other hand, they can be a lot more interesting. That they can be like, packaging these like carry trades or packaging these like more, exotic but effective arbs at some degree of scale. I think a lot of that is just more of a matter of understanding like what is it that people might actually want on chain. What is the reason that someone would execute this on chain versus off chain, right? Because when I think about crypto, I think one of the only reasons that it makes sense, beyond like the whole like regulatory arbitrage for quick money transfer type stuff, is capital formation in a very rapid and if needed regulated manner, right? Like, I think that my original thesis, what I've joked about before, is like crypto is just really good for spicy GoFundmes, and like that's not entirely inaccurate when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? Especially if there's enough demand in the real world for it.
it actually feels like growth to me. Like back you're talking about, like I've been around crypto for a long time, so back like 2016, 2017, when exchanges really started
Yeah,
gaining traction. I remember when called OKX Casino.
yeah, totally.
But I'm like,
Dude, like KuCoin was just listing anything.
yeah, you like go to Yobit, or I think it was OKX too, that you had a spinning wheel. You'd log in, you spin the wheel to weigh something.
Yeah,
Unbelievable. But like, so this feels like growth. Like we're getting somewhere, especially this whole application layer. Like there's
100%.
real world use case.
In terms of like, how do you not have this just be like a bunch of rampant gambling?
Yeah,
And like, there's nothing wrong with rampant gambling. It's just you probably want to have like things to balance that out too, right? So I do think that like some of these things that are RWA adjacent are interesting in that sense, and that you can basically say, okay, cool, this is financing like real things that have economic value, right? That are not purely derived from whether we think the token's going to go up or down.
right.
Sure, they might have adjacencies and they might have correlations to whether a token's going to go up and down over time, but I think that being able to point towards a point of tangibility is also quite interesting. And that's why I feel at times similarly about depend, even though in many cases the tokenomics make that difficult to always get out the rares. But some folks are very thoughtful and more elegant about that. Yeah, and I think the like distribution is one of the things that crypto does worse.
Yeah,
Like there's just very few groups that have really nailed distro. I think you can, count them on your fingers kind of thing.
totally.
I think the deep end is one of the few sectors that, makes distribution a little bit more feasible if you actually do have a competent team on the operations and distro side.
So back to your focus on applications just
Yeah.
in general. So how are you guys viewing that with either partners or what you built yourself to try and improve that?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that we got to do on that ourselves. In that, I think that in many cases, for example, folks looking to engage in proof of liquidity and like, stake and reward vaults that start earning on BGT, they've got to do like 4 or 5 clicks right now, right? And we're working with some different partners, other guys at ENSO we worked with on Royco and stuff, to basically, do like 1-click apps to make that a lot easier for people. We're thinking a lot about what like cleaner mobile applications look like. We're integrating with groups like fun.xyz They'll make it a lot easier to like rapidly on ramps or do like your Apple, Apple ID type login.
Yeah.
Stuff that should just make it easier for people to go from, point A to point B without having to think as much. Well, of course, having the right, like, guardrails in place. It's not like approve a million tokens instantly, right? But I also think that there's like a lot that can be done just in terms of friction reduction, right? Also interested in what happens in, upcoming EIPs and what that can be doing on the account abstraction side. I'm not one of those guys who's like yelling account abstraction from the rooftops and like, smart contract wallets and whatnot. But I do think there's work that can be done there that's productive, right?
Yeah.
In terms of just making it easier for people to engage with simple applications. I think that over time, I am, more and more bullish on mobile as well. I think that the maturity for mobile devs in the space, though, is still quite low. So I've seen very few like strong mobile apps, but I think we've tried to drill into as many of our teams in the ecosystem as possible. Is like, don't let your UX or don't let your front end be what holds you back.
Yeah. There's still a lot of the security that comes with mobile as well.
Totally, totally. Yeah, like, and that's why it's like, there are different strokes for different folks there, right? But some of the folks I know, like, almost exclusively use crypto on their phones,
Yeah.
right? And like, are they moving insane size? No, but are there enough of them moving non-trivial size for that to make a difference? I think so.
I think so too.
Like Pump Fund did a pretty aggressive job in mobile. Like, trading bots on Solana had that entire meta, living out of Telegram, right? So I do think there's appetite for people to use their phones to interact with crypto, ideally outside of just like sort of lottery tickets, etc. Right?
Totally agree.
But yeah, I think that like it's interesting because a lot of times people say, oh, the chain needs to be faster in order for like the app's UX to be better. And I would argue that there's almost like extremes, where there's points of diminishing return. And that like Berachain's block time is like 2 seconds, right? I think there's also the fact where it's like, okay, you can have like some ridiculously beefed up node or whatever it might be, and you can have like a super centralized system, and you can have like, 10 millisecond block times, wherever it might be.
Monads and mega eats.
So yeah, like,
Yeah.
and if that's the case, like amazing, right? But I don't know what the impact will be on user experience yet. I think that people actually, moreover, want like a really responsive front end experience that can actually be built into applications that people are thoughtful.
That's the more important piece. Like,
Well, I just want to click the button and then see the transaction.
what are you interfacing with? Are you really interfacing with the chain, or interfacing with an application?
Exactly, right? So I think that and that's not to say that those chains and those groups don't have their own roles, and that there's value 100%. Um, I just think that it's actually not that hard to retrofit an existing application to have a much more responsive and a much more desirable front end experience. It's just a matter of like engineering standards, and that's something that myself and our CTO talk about a bunch.
On that point, so we're talking UX, but really like DX, developer experience, is a huge part of this too. So how do you guys prioritize that?
I mean, the good thing is like Bearchain's like EVM identical, not just EVM compatible, right? So what that means is that it's not just that, oh, you can deploy stuff in Solidity. It's that the opcodes, the EIPs, it's one-to-one to ETH mainnet. And there's, you run unmodified ETH execution clients on Bearchain. So it makes it quite easy from a dev tooling and or dev experience point of view, because on one hand, while we try to support pretty much anything that you can find on mainnet, and we do have a lot of the major providers supporting us, whether that be so like your on-ramps, your account abstracted solutions, or random indexers and RPC tooling and yada, yada, yada. It's a lot lower lift for those guys to come over as well, because they see a whole bunch of different teams and apps, asking for their support. They see an ecosystem that's, growing at a reasonable rate. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, what's our blocker here? There isn't much of one beyond internal engineering bandwidth or whatnot, right? So I think we figure that the EVM has the greatest concentration of devs. The EVM has the greatest concentration of liquidity. We tend to benefit by, giving those guys as few hurdles as possible, right? So I think a similar thesis on removing friction, but for developers. And then I think apart from that, just trying to make sure that we have very thorough documentation, and, pretty meaningful walkthroughs, office hours, whatever that might be, on anything that you need to actually interact with the chain. And actually in a couple of months, or, sometime in the next little while, we'll roll out sort of this PL Academy course that we've been building as well. That's sort of meant to help, devs that are trying to get up to speed on POL, power users that want to understand all the minutia of POL, etc. So you can think of it as like a mini Coursera, but like for POL stuff.
Yeah, very cool.
And I think that should be like, I think that some people outright fade it. I think a bunch of other people, and in many cases, perhaps, those power law distributions of the 25 to 50 people who might end up building very interesting stuff in the ecosystem, might actually get a really good start from that.
Right. That's how all those things work. Like guides, even guides that we make.
Yeah,
They
no
don't
one
make
reads.
Most people don't read them.
Well, no one reads.
The people that do find it really valuable. There's a
like-
very small group of people.
Yeah.
They're the people that really need it.
Yeah, you need to check the box, but the fact is that most people don't like to read things. Like, that's just how it goes.
How are you guys sourcing the builders on your chain? Because I've heard a lot of different chains go about this a lot of different ways.
I mean, I think the good thing is like we play a pretty, hard and fast ground game. And that we have folks in New York, we have folks across Asia, we have folks like I think where the builders are in many cases. And then also having a relatively robust ecosystem means that a lot of the network effects kick in for us, right? And that someone say, oh, I heard my friend's building on Berachain, they're having a good time doing this or that. Like, maybe they can put me in touch with the team, right? And then it gets a lot easier for us to have like that net promoter score, those soft intros start coming in a much more sustainable way. And that is also one of the metrics that we're sort of looking at internally, which is to say, what's our inbound versus outbound looking like? So I think that, the more strong application developers that there are in an ecosystem, the more strong application developers tend to be attracted to that ecosystem. Like really do get a like attracts like kind of thing there. Um,
Do you guys place like RFPs where you're actually looking for something specific? Yeah.
we haven't as of yet. I've thought about it before, and it's something that I'd like to do. But I also think that like most of the stuff that we're looking for isn't well defined, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In that, like we've got all the basics. So I think we're probably gonna do our first hacker house sometime later in the year as well. And for that, we'd like to have a few different RFPs or ideas lined up, such that if people are new to the ecosystem, they could say, okay, cool, like here's some different shit that could be cool.
Yeah, I'll attack this problem.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like I think it's good to have. I think one thing that I'm trying to work on for the ecosystem as a whole and try to get as much of the team, rally around as possible is having almost a group of folks like in the wings at any point in time, who are either just really strong founders who need a good, good idea to run with, or B, a couple of good ideas that need strong founders to run with them.
Yeah.
Right. That way we can actually just sort of help matchmake that a little bit.
Well, that's funny. That is the definition of this founder space, right? It's rare that somebody's both.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, in most cases, like the groups that are missing are the groups that we meet are missing one thing, right? Either they're like, cracks, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this person's gonna go out and do amazing things.
And yeah, like the peer operators as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in many cases, like the goal as the ecosystem team, whatever it is to help fill those gaps and to help, match make, plug gaps, and act as a source of adjacent scar tissue as these teams are figuring their things out.
How does Build a Bear play a role in all this? And also
Oh,
just what is Build a Bear?
yeah, Build-A-Bear is like sort of effectively arm's length from the foundation. It's a group that's led by Sammy, who's basically been building and starting companies in space a long time. So Redacted, Cartel, Tenero, etc. was part of the New Order incubator in the past, etc. And himself and his co-founder Never have been both core Berachain team members in the past, and now focus a lot based on helping to accelerate the best builders in the Berachain ecosystem. And they basically invest, like YC-esque style, very early, at basically the ideation slash like, founder existing stage, and help to focus on, 0 to 1 ideas in the ecosystem. This is originally done in like a batch model where there's sort of like, different cohorts of like 5 companies. And then I think that, as a group, we sort of chatted and we're like, we don't want to have groups in this for the sake of it. I think it's much better to just keep a really high bar
Yeah.
and say, hey, these guys are like building something incredibly unique, that we haven't seen before and that we think has a real chance of being like that breakout adoption vector within the Berachain ecosystem.
Like how a lot of these big incubators used to be.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, so like taking as a more concentrated shots on net there.
Yeah.
And it's often again, sort of like what I mentioned before. It's like, the founder and or like there's one thing missing. Sometimes it's actually a founder and a good product, but they have no idea how to fundraise. Right. And that's actually probably the easiest problem to set up because you can teach people how to do that. I think the toughest part is when you have like, good products, but like founders doesn't know what they're doing.
We can't teach them to be hungry either.
Yeah, well, I think it's just like it's a longer transformation process, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, Build a Bear more than anything else is like sort of our take on a very mini YC style experiment. And now I think has gone more or less from batch style to more like okay, there's a team they're really interested in that we think is like very early stage, but can benefit from lots of support, hand holding, programming with different mentors and leaders across the VC like the fund, market maker, exchange, whatever spaces. The goal is really just to arm those founders and those teams with all the information they'll need to build an actual company that, will survive and then stand the test of time. And then help them as they go through the fundraising and realization process, if you will. Right. Because I think that can be an extensive one
Yeah.
of going from like, okay, cool. Like we've got a bunch of Figma prototypes. We got our first couple devs. So I think, it's meant to be a bit of a guiding hand through that founder life cycle.
Yeah. Very cool. So how many of your ecosystem founders are contributors to Berachain or previous contributors to Berachain? And I could think of at least a couple.
Yeah, no, there's at least 2 or 3. I think one of our DevRels went on to start building something in like the sort of the trading slash like parallel EVM space as the potential L2 to Berachain. There's a lot of folks who are like part of like the very early community. They were like not necessarily Berachain team members, but like in the Discord back in the day
Yeah.
that went on to found interesting things like Keisha and the Bear Baddies, the team at Goldilocks. There's a bunch that I'm probably forgetting right now, but like there are, I'd say probably north of 10 teams. The Baramonium, Ramen Finance, like there's a lot of these teams that basically started from just like chilling in the Discord and they were like, I should build something.
How supportive of you are that? Like if it's your own employees, like
Yeah.
if it's somebody in a Discord, like great, yeah,
Yeah, if it's our,
you're losing some staff.
I mean, I think it depends a lot on like who it is, to be honest. In that, there's team members before that told me like, hey, like, in the next couple of years or next 1 or 2 years, whatever it is, I want to like go and build my own thing. And I think in most cases, as long as it isn't a blind side, like we're very supportive of that because if they are like net positive, then like, why should we work against that?
Yeah,
Because then someone who actually deeply understands the product and the ecosystem and how POL works, et
they
cetera.
don't need to take the course.
Yeah, like they're just they're ready to go, right?
Yeah,
So I think that like I'm generally quite supportive of that. I think a lot of it just comes down to the nuance around the messaging, et cetera. And like, hey, here's my plan. Here's how we transition me out over X months. Here's how we bring someone in to replace my role, et cetera. And if that's all done, like more power to you, kind of thing.
how big are you guys now?
We're coming on to 70.
Company?
Yeah, so we're trying to stay like try not to bloat. And try to make sure that again with those KPIs we want to have in place, we know who's doing work and who's not doing work.
Yeah,
Because I think power laws also exist in teams.
yeah. There's that whole rule like you can only know 150 people.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
you're 100 more than 150 people in your company. You don't know what everyone's doing,
Exactly.
and I know everyone.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that, like, even within, different teams, it's like, it's tough to make sure that everyone has appropriate context when there's 100 different irons in the fire.
Yeah. So back to time life. So you guys are launched. You launched with what you felt like you needed to launch with.
Yep.
What's coming?
Yeah, I mean, a few different things. One, that's pretty big from the tech side. It's like withdrawals and sort of like Pectra and basically shipping like the next version of like, I suppose, Berachain from a VM sense, if you will, or like a beacon kit sense. So right now, Berachain is like staking, but you can't unstake as of yet, right? So, we'll have the ability to do that likely by Q2. So we're excited about that. I think that should be good from just like a logistics point of view, from, better decentralization point of view, the ability for people to, withdraw their stake feels important. I think that we'll actually see the full rollout of POL within the next couple of weeks. So I think that's also going to be quite
That's
exciting.
exciting. Yeah.
I think that's part of the part that I'm most excited for in the near future. And then I think there's going to be a lot of like these like quality of life slash UX improvements along the way. For example, like, the Bex front end will likely transition into a meta aggregator over time because a whole bunch of folks are going to come into the ecosystem. And as more and more capital isn't just living in the Bex, but might be living in Kodiak or Burbear or Ola's Exchange or whatever it is, it's much better if they have a meta aggregator that they can use to basically say, okay, cool, like I'm pressing this button. There's like a tiny front end fee, but I'm getting the best swap possible. And I don't have to, yeah, I don't have to worry about, oh, is this router good? You just think less, right? And also try not to king make anyone there in that process. Obviously, we love the native teams and aggregators in our ecosystem, but there's at least 3 or 4 different groups that are deployed. So it's like, okay, may the best root win, right?
Create
Um,
a competitive environment.
yeah, I think I'm very bullish on like, highly competitive environments, and that's the only way that you get cool shit built if you have to outperform the standard. And I think that along that way, we're just trying to think about what we can do that makes life as easy as possible for people.
Yeah.
Right. And then I think we'll basically just try to find as many different ways, even from like different chains, if you will, to find people routing into POL and having almost like different outposts that make it very easy to plug into POL as a whole.
Yeah. Very cool. What else are you excited about outside of those core like phase
Yeah.
is coming?
I think I'm like just sort of excited for the rest of the ecosystem to sort of like come to life. And right now, I think we've seen a lot of the DeFi base plate being built, and that's really good. That's like some games, that's consumer funnels from L2s, etc. I think that entire ecosystem is going to unfold over the next like, you know, 3 to 4 months. And I think that's actually when we get to see like sort of more conclusive evidence of what user flow actually looks like. And then how well can we convert folks who are engaging because at first they're on like a sports betting platform or at first they're on like a random like hack and slash game. But then they're like, okay, cool. Maybe I can use these neobank savings account application.
Yeah.
Right. I also think it'll be very cool to build stuff around the Sky slash like previously Maker ecosystem. Because there will be sort of an autonomous slash like standalone version of Spark, if you will, on Berachain, that is able to draw on credit or draw on capital from USDS and like the Sky mothership. And I think that will be quite exciting as well because that's just like a very interesting like injection of stables into the ecosystem that can be used to really help drive, I'd say, value into a lot of these applications, both in the purely DeFi sense and in like these like structured products like RWA type plays, etc. So I think I'm quite excited for that. And then I think at some point a little bit later, I'm excited to see what like the L2 landscape looks like on Vera because there's already one or two. For example, there's the guys who were previously IDEX, like, the first DEX to ever exist.
Yep.
Or not the first DEX, but, basically the first, like,
Relevant.
yeah, exactly. That's why the Ether Delta days and whatnot.
Yep.
To actually, break out, and now they built a, their own L2 powered up by Berachain called Kuma.bit. There's also very cool ways that proof-of-liquidity can plug into L2s. So I'm kind of excited for that thesis in a longer term perspective.
Yeah.
And then I think just continuing building and scaling the team. Like, I think that should be really fun. Because I think that we're getting a better sense of like what works and what doesn't work now in a real environment. And I think there's also more geographical land grabs that we can do.
Yeah. You guys are live. It's one of those like, oh, we're here.
Yeah, like
Yeah. It's like, okay, you look at everybody and then you just keep marching forward.
yeah, just gotta do the thing.
Yeah.
Which is the part that I think is most interesting about BGT, right? It's that the people who will have the most say in the network's governance, adjustment of fee parameters, whatever it might be, addition of new vaults or effectively new pools or new applications that can receive POL emissions, will be those who have had the most skin in the game in the first place. So I think that that's like almost like a philosophy that is good for us to be able to enforce. In that, okay, if you want to say over the network, you have to have contributed something in terms of useful stake and, or more importantly, useful liquidity.
Well, cool. Thank you so much for joining us, Smokey. This is very enlightening.
Of course, man.
And yeah, you're a great guest to have on here, so really appreciate it.
Happy to help.
Thank you guys so much for listening in. And Smokey was a very, very welcome guest, and he's very grateful for you tuning in as well. This has been another episode of The Vault, and this is Jake signing off. Thanks.